Hi, everyone. This is Lee Perry, the Chief Operations Officer of Ideas for Us. Super excited to introduce two guest speakers today from the CLEO Institute and from the Environmental Defense Fund, here to talk about climate resiliency in Latino communities. And we're going to talk about this because communities of color are in the front lines of some of the worst environmental impacts when it comes to climate change and global warming at large. And we really want to highlight some of the data that shows why these communities are at risk. We couldn't do this without the support from our donor, Green Latinos, who gave us some support so that we can be able to do a bunch of different environmental action projects like shoreline restoration projects and also speaking engagements like our Drink Beer Talk Climate event where we talked about water quality and water accessibility issues, and now this really important conversation that we're having today. And so I'm very excited to introduce our two speakers. The first speaker is from the CLEO Institute, Salome Garcia, the Policy and Campaigns Manager of the CLEO Institute over in Tallahassee. And also we have Esther Sosa, who is the Political Affairs and Campaigns Partnership Manager of the Environmental Defense Fund. Ladies, thank you so much, and please introduce yourselves.
Well, hello everyone. My name is Salome Garcia, and I am the Policy and Campaigns Manager for the CLEO Institute. Just wanted to take a moment to say thank you so much for Ideas for Us and EDF for partnering with us on this amazing event and kind of encouraging and motivating these important conversations from happening. So I have my picture and my professional bio on the slide, but I always like to begin these kinds of conversations with telling people my personal story. So that's what I'm going to start doing. So I came from Bogota, Colombia when I was about 6 years old, and I moved to Miami, Florida, to Hialeah. And for those of you that don't know, Hialeah is a very unique place in South Florida. It is the fourth least diverse city in the country. We are over 80% conservative, Cuban, white, Hispanic, more than any other demographic of person. And it is also one of the financially least stable cities in the state of Florida. So it was a very unique place, but I grew up like very many Latina immigrants in Hialeah. My mom had to work two, sometimes three jobs to sustain my sister and I had to get a job at 13 to help out. And so when I was growing up, climate change seemed like the least relevant thing in the world. I did not have time to think about penguins and ice cubes somewhere really far away. We wanted to get food on the table. I needed to get my little sister to school. And it wasn't really until college that two weird things happened. The first thing was that there was an illegal fracking operation happening in Central Florida in Big Cypress National Preserve. And after this illegal fracking operation was shut down, we found out in Hialeah that the wastewater from the fracking operation was transported miles and miles away into Hialeah, which as a big municipality with limited resources, didn't really have the technology needed to be able to process the wastewater. And there were a bunch of water warnings. So we weren't able to drink the tap water, and some of the students were having to go home because they couldn't drink the water on campus. So that was the first really weird thing that happened. And then the second weird thing was that I got my first internship with the Climate Reality Project. And while I was working with the Climate Reality Project in my undergrad, I started really to learn a lot about climate change and environmental issues. But when I would go home after school and I wanted to share with my mom all the amazing things I was learning, I started realizing that none of the materials were in Spanish. And not only from the organization that I worked for, but a lot of environmental research and climate and energy work wasn't available for my mom or my neighbors or my entire family. So I started a local club at my campus, which was Florida International University. And the primary purpose of this organization, which is called Age of Aquarius, was to just advocate for environmental research, but more importantly, translate the materials in Spanish so that we could really communicate the importance of this work to Spanish-speaking families. I then became recognized as one of campus's premier environmental leaders, and I was invited to go to Washington, D.C. and meet President Obama and discuss climate action with then EPA Administrator Gina McCarthy. And as I was in DC talking, it was me and a bunch of university professors and other climate leaders, I realized that I was the only young woman of color in the room. And that a lot of the decisions and the policy solutions that were being discussed were great, but they wouldn't really be accessible or realistic for my mom or the families that were in my neighborhood. And that's really when I started to realize that I loved environmental research. I wanted to be a marine biologist when I first entered campus. And it was at that point in time that I realized that my calling was actually environmental, climate, and energy policy. And ever since then, I've been working. I started as a grassroots organizer. I got a degree in climate change and health at Yale. And now I'm a JD candidate at FSU's College of Law. And through all of my work, I had a very specific interest, which means my passion is on uplifting people of color and immigrant families, bring them to the table for climate and energy solutions. So that's a little bit about me. And now I'm going to go into kind of the work that I do now with the CLEO Institute. So the first thing is we're going to take we're going to time travel back to when we were all in grade school and remember where the foundation for all of the information, all of the work that we do comes from. The CLEO Institute, at the end of the day, we are a communications nonprofit. Our number one priority is to communicate the science, the impact, and the solutions of the climate crisis to every resident, members of Congress, members of the press, elected officials, even students and parents alike. And we always start with the science. You might remember a little something called the greenhouse gas effect. And what a lot of people tend to forget about the greenhouse gas effect is that it is a really great thing. We like the greenhouse gas effect. The greenhouse gas effect is what keeps the energy that we get from the sun into our atmosphere, giving us that Goldilocks temperature. Without the greenhouse gas effect, we would be living in an icy tundra. Because of the greenhouse gas effect, those greenhouse gases form a little bubble around the earth, keeping us warm. The problem is that too many greenhouse gases are making our earth too hot. And so actually in the past 5 years, we have recorded some of the hottest temperatures on record. And what does this mean? So we know that the earth is getting hotter. We know that the last 5 years have been the hottest on records. Because of that, our global temperature is rising, our sea level is rising, and that in turn is impacting every aspect of our lives. When we talk about social and racial justice, we are really talking about the system in place that is actually impacting certain communities more than others. We know that frontline communities, vulnerable communities, communities of color across not only the United States, but around the world they have higher proximity to landfills, for example. And when I talk about this, it often brings me back to when I was in college and when we had the fracking wastewater transported miles away to my community in Hialeah. We also see frontline communities have less access to quality food, less access to healthcare, and we're dealing with environmental racism at a higher level. So now is when we're starting to talk about the impacts. We know that because our temperature is rising, we're seeing impact on public health, on our economy, on immigration, basically every single aspect of our life. And at the CLEO Institute, we really try to drive home that climate change is not only an environmental issue. Climate change is an issue multiplier, touching every single aspect of our lives. I live in Tallahassee, Florida now, which is in North Florida. So a lot of these facts are going to be targeting my community, but recently, the Union of Concerned Scientists actually has an interactive website. So if you Google Union of Concerned Scientists extreme heat maps, you can actually type in your zip code and city and see how many extreme heat days are going to be in your neighborhood within the next 5, 25, or 50 years. Here in Tallahassee, we actually see temperatures over 105 degrees, and we're on course to have more than 50 days per year with a heat index over 105 degrees. What does that mean? That means it is dangerous for firefighters to be out in their uniform. It's dangerous for our agricultural workers to be out collecting our food. It's even dangerous for high school football players to be out during practice, or for kids wearing band uniforms to go out for football games. But football games are not the only things getting impacted by extreme heat. We actually see that in a lot of communities, people are feeling the heat way more. And there's a couple interesting facts to take into account when thinking about how some communities are getting disproportionately impacted by this extreme heat. The first interesting fact is that the US Department of Housing and Urban Development doesn't require air conditioning units in affordable public housing. So in Florida, you need to have heaters, but not air conditioning units. Another interesting fact, and I'm sure many of you have probably seen this in your day-to-day life, is that lower income and vulnerable communities typically have less green spaces and less tree canopy. So you're living in a home with 0 to no air conditioning, and you're going to take the bus to go to work because you don't have a car. So at home it's hot, on the way to the bus stop is hot, and this is a really great example of many bus stops that look like this that don't even have shelter from the heat in place. So these are just some of the ways that certain people are getting just living hot lives year round. And actually, there is research happening, really amazing all over the country, but in Florida as well, that show that there is a correlation between extreme heat and things like gun violence, domestic violence abuse, and even mental health issues in in low-income communities all over the country. Just mentioned that mental health. So we actually also know that there's a severe correlation between mental health and extreme weather events. In fact, after extreme hurricanes, we have uplifted a research after Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, where anxiety, depression, and even suicide rates went way up after Hurricane Maria. And one of the things that we work on in our Tallahassee and North Florida office is food insecurity. As our temperatures are increasing, that means that our agricultural industry is decreasing in productivity, because hotter temperatures means that our crops have a harder time surviving. And it also means that our agricultural workers are less effective because they're hot all the time. So as our agricultural productivity goes down, our prices are going up. And as those food prices go up in local and national scales, different food markets or grocery stores don't have as much of a financial incentive to open up in low-income communities, really exacerbating that food insecurity. You can find out the food insecurity rates in your local neighborhood or in your state at Feeding America. Here in Leon County, we are the 4th in the state in terms of highest food insecurity rates. And this exacerbates food deserts. So food deserts are a place where you don't have access to healthy food nearby. So if you don't have access to a car, you really don't have a way to get fresh produce. But these aren't new issues. This is something that's just starting to happen. We've been dealing with environmental racism ever since the beginning of our country's existence, really. In fact, now there's a lot of really great data to record that, for example, Latinx Americans are exposed to 63% more pollution than we produce. And Black Americans are exposed to 56% more pollution than they produce. In comparison with, for example, non-Hispanic white Americans, which are exposed to almost 20% less pollution than they produce. We like to say that there is no climate justice without social justice. And that's why we love to talk about intersectional environmentalism, because in order for us to really thrive in a green economy, we need to examine and uplift the systemic issues in our country in order to be able to solve them and move forward in an equitable way. But don't fret, there are a lot of solutions that can be done at the local, national, and even international level. And some are as easy as just knowing the issues. As I mentioned, intersectional environmentalism is a really interesting way to examine climate and energy issues where we're prioritizing both the people and the planet. And we really acknowledge that every single issue that we talk about is interconnected. We can't really talk about climate change without talking about economic inequity, or without talking about access to education or affordable housing or public transportation. And it's important to be able to recognize that social inequality in order to be able to move forward and to amplify voices that really have been experiencing these disproportionate impacts for so long. I remember when I was in Washington, D.C., literally in Obama's administration, I mean, I was so happy, but still listening to these solutions, so many of them weren't really accessible to my mom. And now in my work, I wish I could go back in time and have taken my mom to that meeting at the White House, because we often talk about frontline community residents as oh, we need to advocate for frontline community residents, where in reality, what we need to do is we need to be bringing new, more diverse voices into the rooms with us, listening to their experiences. A lot of the time, residents that have been facing these inequities are the best advocates for themselves. And that's how we become the best allies that we can be, by listening, by being open-minded, and by encouraging dialogue. Everybody has privilege, and having privilege is not a bad thing. I have privilege by having internet connection and by having lights and being able to get an education. Having privilege is a really wonderful thing. What I encourage everyone to do is to step into whatever privilege you do have and bring people up with you, amplifying the voices of people that need to be at the table, or of community residents that have been historically underrepresented in these types of decisions. And educate. Share information on social media, attend lectures like this, share this video with your friends, with your family, post it on your social media platforms, and continue to read. I've been doing this work for a few years, and I learn something new every single day. Every time that I talk to coworkers, or even every time that I step into a room to give a lecture, I'm learning more things. But we're not in a normal situation, and I'm not going to physical in-person lectures to interact with people every day. So COVID-19 is also presenting new weird challenges that we have to face with. And again, you can't really talk about a healthy recovery from coronavirus without talking about equity and social and racial issues that go along with that. So we see here how many jobs new industries can bring to the table. If we directed government spending on renewable energy or energy efficiency over fossil fuel projects, we can be actually adding 75 to 77 more jobs per $10 million in spending, both directly and indirecting. So it's really important that, as well as educating our community and being an ally, we're also putting pressure on our elected officials and holding them accountable to making sure that as we're healing from COVID, we're healing in a good, environmentally sound, sustainable, and equitable way. And of course, I would be remiss not to mention the election, which is coming up. The election, which is coming up. Okay, so the best way to be an advocate is by making sure that you go out and vote with the issues in mind. So make sure you're registered to vote, that you encourage your friends and your family to register to vote, and make sure you're casting that ballot, not only in the 2020 election, but in every single election moving forward. And there's some really great local solutions that you can also get involved with hands-on. I'm sure that there's a community garden near you. This is a picture of the community garden in Tallahassee that is run by a local university. food pantries, second harvest food drives, farmer markets. One of the most meaningful ways to physically be able to see good community growth is by getting involved with a local nonprofit near you. One of our favorite ways here in Tallahassee is by combating food insecurity. And be an advocate, not only for yourself, but for your community, your family, and the more vulnerable communities around you as well. Making sure that frontline communities are heard and amplified. Research who you're voting for and research your current politicians to making sure that you're holding them accountable. Attending climate strikes, signing petitions. There's so many ways to get involved. So what I always recommend is find a local nonprofit that does work near you, sign on to their email alert, and nonprofits are always sending amazing calls to action of timely and important information. All three of the nonprofits hosting this event, EDF, Ideas for Us, the CLEO Institute, we're constantly sending out calls to actions and way to volunteer. So make sure you sign up for the email newsletter and keep involved that way. So these are just some of the ways that you can get involved at the CLEO Institute. You can just sign onto our email list by texting climate action to 44321. Follow us on social media. And this is our 8 ways to get involved table with all of our different programs. We have business partnerships and government partnerships and youth empowerment. We have a ton of different ways. So make sure that you text that number and feel free to email me if you have any more questions. Thank you so much. And now I leave it to Esther Sosa with EDF.
Yeah, thank you, Salome, for the beautiful presentation. There's a lot of information there, and that is good to think about. My name is Esther Sosa, and I work with EDF, and part of my job is looking at how climate change affects the Latino community. EDF, in case you're not familiar with the work that we do, our mission is to preserve the natural systems on which all life depends. This has drawn us to areas that span from the biosphere, from climate to oceans, ecosystems, and health. Since these topics are intertwined, our solutions take a multidisciplinary approach. We work in concert with organizations as well as businesses and governments and communities. So if you go to the next slide, Salome beautifully summarized the multifaceted impacts that we are experiencing largely come from our demand for energy. If you go to the next slide, the demand, one more slide. The demand for energy is the highest it's ever been in the history of our species. As you can see from my slides, the burning of fossil fuels for energy production is the second largest source of carbon pollution behind the transportation sector. Nearly 2/3 of our electricity in the US comes from the burning of coal or natural gas. While coal power plants generate less than 30% of the sector's energy, it accounts for 66% of the overall CO2 emissions. Renewable energy sources such as hydroelectricity, wind, and solar, on the other hand, has zero carbon emissions. If you go to the next slide, because our partners are in Florida, I'll discuss some of our Florida energy data. As you can see in this slide, energy is an important part of Florida's economy. After Texas, Florida is the second largest energy producer in the United States and is the 4th largest energy consumer. Tourism is responsible for much of the transportation-related fuel use. Historically, coal was the largest source of electricity in Florida up to 2003, when it was surpassed by natural gas due to the replacement of many older coal-fired units. In 2018, about 12% of electricity made in Florida was from coal, and 70% was generated from natural gas power plants. In that same year, solar energy accounted for more than 1/3 of Florida's renewable sourced electricity generation, or about 2.9 million megawatt hours. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see here is a map of all of the all of the power plants in Florida. And if you zoom in on Orlando, you'll see that the facilities, there are 2,855 facilities that are in violation of clean air and water standards. This data is from the EPA ECHO database. So what does this all have to do in terms of the vitality of the Latino community? Energy production and health are not two separate issues. The health outcomes that result from consistent exposure to air pollution range from increased hospital admissions and emergency room visits to increased risk of premature death. So if you go to my next slide, particulate matter is commonly used to represent all types of air pollution. It affects more people than any other pollutant. It is a complex mixture of solid and liquids, particles, organic and inorganic substances that are suspended into the air. And what we're most concerned about is fine particulate matter that are less than 2.5 micrometers in size, which is about, for reference, a 30th the size of a single strand of hair. These particles can penetrate deep into the lungs and even enter into the blood. Long-term exposure is associated with cardiovascular disease or respiratory conditions, and even lung cancer. PM 2.5 is estimated to be responsible for 100,000 deaths per year. This is more than traffic accidents or any drug-related deaths combined. Research also shows that it affects babies in the womb. It affects the lungs and the brains of a forming baby. The Environmental Protection Agency, which is supposed to set standards that regulate emissions to protect public health, over the last 4 years has rolled back on some of these safeguards. This is particularly harmful to the Latino community who are already at higher risk to air pollution exposure. So let me give you some data. 2 out of every 5 Latinos live within 30 miles of a power plant. Nearly half of Latinos in the US live in cities that frequently violate air quality standards, such as Los Angeles or Bakersfield in California, El Paso, Texas, and Phoenix, Arizona. According to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Office of Minority Health, in 2012, nearly 2.15 million Latinos reported that they had asthma. Latinos are 60% more likely to visit the hospital for asthma compared to non-Hispanic whites, and Latino children are 40% more likely to die from asthma as compared to non-Hispanic white children. This data does not take into consideration that Latinos are either underinsured or don't have insurance, and typically do not have access to an asthma specialist. At EF, we know the importance of improving air quality for all, and understand that it comes down to an issue of equity for those that bear the brunt of the exposure. So if we go to our next slide, research shows, as Salome beautifully put, that Latinos on average breathe in 63% more air pollution than they create through their activities and their consumption than non-Hispanic white Americans. As I mentioned earlier too, climate change is a reality for Latinos. We know that it's already here, and that should come as no surprise because 55% of Latinos live in California, Texas, Florida, which have experienced major impacts from climate change. Something I'd like to highlight is that extreme weather events driven by climate change can also make the pollution burden worse for Latinos. For example, after Hurricane Harvey, the petrochemical industry released 320 tons of extra toxic pollution in Houston. nearly all of it concentrated within 4 miles of a neighborhood that is 98% Latino. To compound this distress, data shows that Latinos are less economically resilient to be able to bounce back from a climate-related event. In 2014, 25% of the Latino population were living in poverty compared to 10% of their non-Hispanic white counterparts. It's not looking good for us under the current modus operandi, but there are always opportunities, and that leads me to my next slide. As I mentioned earlier, that the power sector has been undergoing a historic and rapid transformation over the last 10 years for a lot of reasons, but one of them is the plummeting cost of clean energy. What that means for communities like Orlando is, for example, is that there is now a historic opportunity to reduce pollution from high emitting sources like aging coal-fired power plants, while also reducing the cost of electricity or energy for the consumers. According to the US Energy Information Administration, carbon dioxide or CO2 emissions from the US power sector as a whole declined 33% between 2005 and 2019. Over the same period, coal generation declined from 51% of the total energy generation mix to 24%. Wind generation has increased over 18-fold, and solar power has increased over 130-fold. In fact, electricity generation from renewables and zero carbon sources surpassed coal for the first time in 2019. At the same time, retail prices for electricity dropped over the last 10 years. And this is great news for Latinos because in 2015, over 45% of Latino households reporting having challenges paying their energy bills. And if we don't act, energy bills are going to continue to go up. And so this leads me to my final slide, and that is that we need to have new investments that create and support jobs in the clean energy sector. As we saw from Salome's presentation, we know that that clean energy jobs are more than coal energy jobs, right? And 21% of the workers in wind and solar are Latino. And the share of Latinos working in solar and wind is 2 to 3 percentage points higher than the average share of Latinos working across all other industries in the United States. So there's great opportunity for Latinos in the clean energy sector, and there are more jobs that are created within these clean energy sectors. So the first thing I would ask Latinos is to talk to your family and friends about climate change. What is it? What it does to your community, and why are you concerned? Latinos are the most concerned group, but they think that most Latinos are not concerned. So this means that they must not be talking to each other. So talk about climate change during the holidays, whenever you have a free time. And then the second thing is contact your local officials. Tell them that you're concerned. Tell them that the richest country in the world should not be having to choose between clean air and jobs. We should be able to do both, and we have the capacity and technology to do both. But if elected officials do not hear that this is something that we care about, they bring it down in their list of priorities. So with that, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was such a great presentation. I'm really glad that we were able to showcase you in all of those really important facts that I feel need to be discussed publicly. We need to have conversations with our families, like you said, about what's happening to our communities and the pollution and all of the environmental injustices that we're seeing in our communities. we need to talk about them. And so I just really appreciate you making the time today. If you wanted to say some closing remarks on how to get involved with the CLEO Institute or EDF.
Thank you so much, Esther. That was a wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed it. And sure, you know, there is oftentimes so much to do that it may feel overwhelming, but I just want to encourage everyone watching this video that that should be encouraging. Please visit the CLEO Institute's website, sign on to our newsletter. There is space for everyone in the movement, whether it be sending a letter to representatives, whether it be planning or just volunteering at a phone bank, or even just educating friends and family or sharing something on social media. Sometimes I think it can be overwhelming, but I promise if we take it one action at a time, and even just the simplest thing can make the biggest impact. Because that, you know, this isn't about one person or one candidate, it's about a movement in history. So thank you for watching, and I hope you follow us. And if you have any questions at all, please email me. My email is right on the slide.
What I would say, like to follow up on Salome's point, it could seem overwhelming, but there's so many opportunities to get engaged. There are different groups, right? Small, big, all looking and working towards the same, whether water is something that you care about, or whether food security is something that you care about, or whether transportation is something that you care about. Talk about it, organize, and find the organization that fits you and really works towards your issues. So thank you all for tuning in and listening to us, and feel free to contact us if you have any questions about any of the material that was shared. We're happy to have a conversation and continue to discuss, because climate change is an evolving issue, something that we're consistently learning about. So we're excited to continue learning together.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And if anybody is in the Orlando area, Central Florida area, and you want to get involved with some hands-on action out in the community, whether it's shoreline restoration projects or soil workers training programs, pollinator garden installations, waste audits, you name it, we do it. Definitely feel free to contact us as well with ideas for us, and definitely visit our website, ideasforus.org. Thank you, ladies, both so much for your time, and I hope you have a wonderful evening.